you very much. Madam Prime Minister, I know your time is very limited with us, but before I go on to make my presentation, I would very much like to present you with a gift here, which has just come off the press. We presented it last week in New York. This is a map that we produce regularly on women in politics around the world. It shows how women fared in 2018, although it's 2019, it's published in 2019. It shows the number of percentage of women who hold executive office, head of state, head of government. It also shows the number of women ministers in different governments around the world, women speakers of parliament, members of parliament, and I am very pleased to present you with this map because you will see, if you look at Iceland here, it is one of the only 5 or 10 countries in the world with a female head of government, and you in particular. So I want to present this to you. And I also want to show that Iceland is doing very well in terms of women's participation in parliament. I think you have 38% or so of parliamentary membership that is made up of women, which is a good score, the top 20. So I want to congratulate you on that and leave this with you. I hope that you can put it in your office and show. I will. And show.
Thank you.
And so this is the copy of this one is Women in Parliament in 2018. This sets the study that I'm presenting to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Honorable Speaker of Parliament, Honorable Prime Minister, I also recognize members of government who are here today, members of Parliament, and generally top political leadership of Iceland. It is a great pleasure for me to be here. In fact, it is an honor for me to have been invited to Iceland. On a personal note, this is my maiden visit to Iceland. So you can imagine how thrilled I am to be here with you today for the first time. It is also very important for me to reach out to one of the long-standing members of the IPU, Iceland. You are the oldest parliament in the world, and you have been a member of the IPU since 1951. That is, you've been in the IPU for 69 or 68 years now, which is no mean feat. And I see that you have been very active in the organization. So it gives me pleasure to come to talk to you about a subject about which I feel very passionate, not out of emotion, but out of our firm belief that what we are doing is something that is right for society, fighting for women's rights, women's right to be politically active and to influence the way society is being run. So this morning, I would like to present to you a study that we conducted last year on sexism, harassment, and violence against women in parliaments in Europe. You may ask, why conduct such a study? What's the problem? There's definitely a problem. We think that women have the right to be politically active. They have the right to participate in the way society is run. And we have realized that in order for us to achieve gender equality in political representation, we need to identify not only the strong points, the strength and good practices that exist for women's political representation, but we also have to address those issues that, or problems that impede women's political representation. And one of those issues is sexism, sexual harassment, and sexual abuse in general. It deters women from participating in political life, and we don't want to make it feel like it's a women's issue. It's a societal issue for all of society to resolve. Because when women are victims of sexism, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, their ability to, first of all, they are deterred from politics. Secondly, when they are in parliament, they do not fully make an impact on the way parliament is functioning, because their freedom of expression is inhibited. They feel threatened, and they quite often just keep quiet or are guarded in what they say in parliament, so they don't become effective. And this rubs up on parliaments. Parliaments become less effective, and it's democracy that suffers. Because if you don't have a strong parliament in any society, then democracy is hampered. So we thought that it was important to shed light on this particular issue, which we need to address in a very robust manner. We had started with a global survey in 2016 when we had confirmation that sexual abuse in general, sexual violence, was very universal and systemic in the world today, and that something had to be done about it. We then decided that having had the global perspective, we needed to look at the various regions and see how things were rolling out in the various regions, and see if there are some differences that could be tackled in the global approach to sexual violence. And so we came up with this study that we did in cooperation with the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe for European parliaments to see how things were panning out. And again, we realized that the situation was more widespread than we had thought. There was a lot of sweeping the problem under the rug, under the carpet, giving the impression that it didn't exist, whereas it did exist. So if you ask me why this study, I will say that it is important to create awareness of the problem. It is important to ensure that this problem is recognized as existing, and then apply what we might term shock therapy. And I believe that the Me Too movement is part of that whole approach of bringing out this phenomenon into the public and pushing and bringing pressure to bear on everybody to do something about it. And we wanted to do so on the basis of data evidence, not just anecdotes saying that women were being subject or victims of violence against them, but we wanted to show that with statistics what this happened, so how this happens. And so we went on to have this study, which shows that, first of all, violence against women. Is there somebody who will help me with the slides? Okay, it just, well, that would, yes, that one. Which is the button you press? That one. Okay, so you will see that, first of all, violence against women is something that affects 1 out of every 3 women in the world today. And we now have statistics to show that. Secondly, we are saying that it's not something that is localized. No society, no culture or socioeconomic class is immune. Every society, every component of society is affected by this. And again, we see that the increase in the number of women in parliaments is calling into question pre-established norms of representation in various institutions that were fashioned by men and predominantly controlled by men. And this has led to some resistance from the male counterparts. And this has panned out in the form of gender-specific intimidation and violence. So this is how we did the 2016 and the 2018 reports. You will see that for the global report, we interviewed some 55 women parliamentarians representing 39 countries and 5 regions of the world all age groups, and you had people from both the majority parties and the opposition parties. And that study, as I said, led to the recognition of the problem that is universal and systematic. And then this year, our sample is a little bit larger, where we have 123 women MPs from 45 European countries, 81, well, you have 85 women MPs and 42 women staff of parliaments, all age groups. And again, the distribution between majority and opposition parties is roughly the same, 50% for majority parties and 41% for the opposition parties. What we see here then is that the sample in our report in 2018 is roughly more representative than the one in 2016. But if we can not claim that this survey is statistically accurate, it gives us a clear vision of what the situation is in the world, in the European countries today. So, as I said, we wanted to complement the global picture with a more specific regional picture. And we're going to do this in other parts of the world, not only in Europe. We're going to go to Africa, Asia, Latin America, in order to continue to identify the statistics there. I think I got the, yeah, okay. I must say that the survey was conducted in a voluntary manner. No member of parliament or parliamentary staff was compelled to undergo the survey, and it was done in confidence. It was confidential through face-to-face meetings, but also through Skype and phone conversations. So now what are the findings? You will see then that, and that's the shocking news, that 85.2% of those who responded to the survey said that they have been victims of psychological violence. 85.2%. And of those, 46.9% had received death threats or threats of rape or beating, which is very serious. 67.9% had been the target of sexist comments, in one form or the other, through social media or during proceedings of parliament, such. And then you would look at that graph that we present there, and we show the situation in the various forms of violence against women, sexism. Those, the greener shades there, those are the victims, the experiences, those who have said they had experienced some form of violence. And then the blue are those who, the blue are those who actually experience violence. And then the lighter shade of green or blue, depending on what you see, are those who actually reported the incident. So there, one of the things that we report, as you'll see later, is that there is substantial underreporting of incidents of violence against women. So, the next slide. Next slide there, again, the findings, you see that 24.7% of the women interviewed, women parliamentarians, said that they had been sexually harassed. 14%, 14.8% had suffered physical violence, which is very serious indeed. And when you talk of sexual harassment, in 75.9% of the cases, of these cases, this had been perpetrated by male colleagues, not only from their own party, I mean the parties of the members of parliament represented, but also from opposition parties. And when you talk of physical violence, this including actual slapping of women, hitting them or hurling objects at them. So very serious phenomenon. And then the next one, I think we just give you some quotes from members of parliament to show you the extent of this problem. First of all, stereotyping, gender stereotyping, saying women are not, they're supposed to be beautiful, they're supposed to be charming, their place is not in parliament, sorry. Oop. Okay, back here. So, they are supposed to be charming, beautiful. They're not supposed to be discussing important issues. Terrible, indeed. And then, you find this British, I think it's in Britain, is that women are too young and stupid. They should go to the kitchen. That's where they belong, which is not very good at all. Then we continue with the findings, and we discovered that being a woman was serious enough, but being a young woman was even more serious, and that younger women tended to be more victims of sexual abuse and harassment than their male counterparts. And I think the figures there are very revealing. You see, for each form of violence, the victims of violence under 40 years, you have more people suffering from violence and all of that. Sexual or sexist remarks. For all interviewees, it was 67%, but for women, it jumped by 10 percentage points to 77%. And that's the situation throughout those various forms of violence. So the point that we make also is that maybe this has to do with the fact that women, younger women, tend to be more present on social networks, and so prone to attacks. They tend to be very activists on certain issues, and so they are more exposed than their older colleagues in the social media. Then we look at parliamentary staff. That's parliamentary staff. The situation is similarly very alarming, where we saw that there have been substantial amounts of sexual and psychological harassment and bullying for parliamentary staff, and the figures are very revealing there. And the general observation that we made in this study is that while for members of parliament, it was a question of men feeling threatened by the massive increase of women's numbers in parliaments and the challenging of pre-established societal norms. When it comes to the female parliamentary staff, it had to do with hierarchy. It had to do with the balance of power between the employer, supposed employer, and the employee. The superiority complex that was displayed by the male perpetrators of this. So again, we see that it is men who have been generally the culprits in sexual harassment or sexual bullying of women. Again, I think we have there some quotes from some female staff members of the types of harassment that they have undergone. Yeah, making advances against them, making sexual statements that have terrible connotations, and things that are generally unacceptable. We continue with that, and then we move on to what we call the underreporting of the phenomenon. And there, I think it has to do. Yeah, underreporting has to do with a lot of Parliament as a public institution denying the existence of the problem, sweeping the problem under the rug, so to speak. And it had to take the Me Too movement to bring this out into the open and to say, no, this is a problem that we need to resolve. And we see that just 23.5% of female MPs and 6% of female members of Parliament had reported incidents of violence perpetrated against them. And when you compare that with the 85% of members of Parliament who had reported being victims of sexual misconduct, the discrepancy is very clear, the gap is very clear. And where we saw greater levels of reporting is when it had to do with the physical integrity of women parliamentarians or parliamentary staff. When they were threatened by death or beating or rape, they tended to go and report to the police. And then we see there, I think, yeah? Sorry. That's some of the reasons women give for not reporting. A politician is supposed to be strong. They should not display any weakness. They should not be crybabies. Sorry. The computer is play acting. And then we also have the fact that many victims did not trust those mechanisms that have been put in place to tackle sexual harassment, sexual abuse. They do not believe in the objectivity and fairness of the process or the confidentiality of it, and so they lacked faith. And another reason for not reporting has to do with loyalty. Members of parliament have to be loyal to the political parties. They don't have to portray their political parties in a very bad light, and so this tended to bring down levels of reporting. So 23%. Okay, so simply again, then you see why we have those high levels of underreporting. First of all, the institutional environment. There's a feeling among the victims that the institutional environment tolerates, condones this type of behavior. There's no proper mechanism, and where that mechanism exists, it is not considered to be effective or fair. And it also has to do with the image of the institution, as I've explained, and the career for the staff members, their career. They fear losing their jobs if they report wrongdoing by their employers. And then we talk about, I've mentioned the power imbalance between men and women, whether they're members of parliament or the hierarchical relations regarding staff members. And then generally too, women, the victims, feel that they are being considered by those they report to as having provoked the sexual misconduct by the perpetrators, and sometimes they don't believe them. I think the Me Too movement has really brought out the scale of this phenomenon, and people are beginning to realize that not everything that the victims or supposed victims have said is untrue, that it's actually the case. So there's some element of self-guilt here that we also have to address. Now, now that we have identified the problem, what are the solutions? And these solutions we have seen exist in many parliaments in Europe today. And there are lots of good practices and policies that are out there. And we, in this study, recommend that the laws be strengthened, where there are no laws, that these laws be put in place, and that they are strictly enforced. And there are some certain phenomena that have exacerbated the issue of sexual misconduct, and that is the emergence of new technologies, the emergence of social networks that have amplified the problem. And so any laws that need to be strengthened or established should factor in how to deal with online bullying, online harassment. And there, we are not saying that you regulate social media or the internet in terms of restricting use, but that you streamline it and put in place mechanisms that allow to identify perpetrators of acts of bullying, harassment online, and that measures are taken to punish perpetrators adequately. So then we also talk about strong internal policies, structures, and mechanisms in Parliament itself, because Parliament has to be seen as the beacon of policies and action that discourages such things from happening. We have noticed, and it's very clear over the years, that when you look at public institutions, parliaments are really suffering in terms of their image. They are quite often the subject of mistrust by the citizens, and it is not through misconduct by parliamentarians or parliaments when it comes to sexual norms that would help to improve that image. So parliaments should be more forthcoming in putting in place internal policies and structures that would help address the issue. So we also suggest that there should be a complete change in political culture. We need to show that, for instance, sexual harassment, sexual abuse can no longer be tolerated or condoned in any society. So in this study, we have identified the responses from Parliament. We see that parliaments have put in place strong specific policies, and there is increasingly institutional commitment. We were not able to ascertain that all parliaments were doing the same thing, but a substantial number of them are putting in place specific policies and have taken institutional commitments. We have also seen that there's evidence that parliaments are carrying out an assessment of the situation, and we are encouraging these assessments, maybe using the methodology that we used for this study, so as to identify the issue, the scale of the issue, and then to be able to adopt mechanisms or policies that address the issue. We have also suggested that there should be increasing access for victims of sexual violence, sexual abuse, to services that provide assistance and counseling in order to make the victims feel comfortable in their environment. And these mechanisms and processes should be seen, should be effective and fair as well as objective. And there should be a strong element of confidentiality in it. Of course, you have the good side of it, persuasion, policies, but then it is also important to put in place mechanisms, sanctions, disciplinary sanctions for those who continue, in spite of the policies, to perpetrate different forms of sexual violence against women. So this you have the carrot and the stick approach. If the policies don't work, the incentives don't work, then you have to hit hard on those who are found guilty of misconduct. And here we want to mention the specific issue of parliamentary immunity. Parliamentary immunity is used by many parliamentarians to protect themselves from misconduct. And I'm sure as parliamentarians you will agree that immunity is not intended to place parliamentarians above the law. Immunity is intended to protect the integrity of Parliament from arbitrary treatment by other forces. So if a parliamentarian is found guilty of misconduct, they should face the full force of the law. And that is what is happening in many jurisdictions in Europe today. To say that when a parliamentarian is found guilty of a crime, a criminal conduct, then they can be stripped of their immunity in order to face the full force of the law. And finally, the last set of measures has to do with training, has to do with awareness raising, has to do with education. Because many of the perpetrators may not know that what they're doing or saying is wrong or improper, inappropriate. So it is important to have that campaign to continue to educate everyone that works in a parliamentary environment on respect for one another, on language that needs to be used, acts that don't have to be perpetrated in Parliament. And so for each of those categories that I mentioned, you will see what various parliaments in Europe are doing. And there I want to single out the European, the European Parliament, the original parliamentary institution in Brussels or Strasbourg or Luxembourg. They are very progressive in the way they have embraced all these sets of policies and actions that I have mentioned here. As I said initially, it was not possible for us during this study, given the short period of time. We did this study between January and June 2018. It was not possible for us to ascertain that all parliaments were doing what all parliaments were doing, but I'm sure there are lots of other good practices that are out there. And we have just mentioned what Finland is doing in terms of Parliament taking the lead in preventing inappropriate conduct and harassment in 2017. And I can also mention Canada is not a European Parliament, it's a North American Parliament, but there is zero tolerance of sexual misconduct. And when you become an MP, you are called upon to sign up to a code of conduct whereby you undertake not to engage in any inappropriate action, and that you consider that you are liable for criminal proceedings if you do infringe that code of conduct. It is something that we think is very important. And then we look at the UK. I think the UK has an internal investigation mechanism, independent inquiry that they did in 2017 and 2018 to shed light on allegations of sexual misconduct, and that is a way of creating awareness of the issue. And then you have Austria, I think Austria and Switzerland that have mechanisms to provide assistance and counseling services to victims of sexual misconduct. Then we have Sweden, where you have policy and guidelines on abusive behavior. The European Parliament that has an advisory committee that is responsible for carrying out assessments of complaints and sexual harassment in the parliamentary environment. Then we see the European Parliament again, I think, yeah, the European Parliament being very forthcoming when it comes to sanctioning, where there is proven guilt on the part of parliamentarians or parliamentary staff. They can be reprimanded, they can be removed or suspended from Parliament, or some of their functions can actually be removed by the President of the European Parliament. Then coming to training, you see the European Parliament again, they're organizing specific courses for members of Parliament, the MEPs and parliamentary staff. Then they also have a guide on zero tolerance, zero harassment in the workplace. France is another one that is also doing some good work in terms of the poster campaign there. And at the global level, yeah, there are a lot of policy pronouncements out there. You have there are a number of them that have been mentioned, and we start, of course, with the IPU, if you don't mind. We have a resolution as late as 2016 that actually lays emphasis on the need for women's freedom to participate in political processes without any interference. And so it is important to build partnerships between men and women. And the point I made, I think, earlier in my presentation was that this should not be seen as a women's issue. It's a societal issue, which means that it needs to be addressed by both men and women. Men and women have to work together in order to resolve the issue of sexual violence. And then we have other statements from the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its causes and consequences. We have efforts that are carried out within the UN General Assembly to fight the phenomenon. Let me now conclude, if I may, to say that we have now recognized that the issue of sexual misconduct, sexual harassment, sexism, especially in the parliamentary environment, is one that is widespread. It needs to be tackled. It needs to be tackled because it makes sense to protect the victims, the human rights of the victims, where in particular you have physical tampering with the integrity, the physical integrity of women in particular, but in many cases also men. So it's a human rights issue that we're dealing with. It is also sensible to do something about it because sexism and sexual harassment is an impediment to political emancipation, be it for women or men who are the victims thereof. And we are in the 21st century. Societal norms have changed. Patterns of behavior in the world are changing, evolving. There are new technologies that are coming into place. These have to be factored into the way society is organized. And we can no longer tolerate violence against any significant segment of the population. It makes sense to have a comprehensive approach to fighting sexism because Parliament is supposed to be a mirror of society. Parliament is supposed to be inclusive of all components of society. Parliament is supposed to be representative, not only in terms of the numbers, we mentioned the number of women in Parliament, but also in terms of the way Parliament addresses the interests of various segments of society. And this cannot be effective if certain segments of that society are not able to contribute freely and safely to parliamentary proceedings and deliberations. So it is important to tackle this particular issue. So a comprehensive response is required, but also it is important, and I commend you for, here in Iceland on establishing a non-partisan cross-party alliance in support of the efforts to combat sexism. This is the type of approach that we want to see, because sexism, sexual harassment, and all forms of sexual abuse are not political in nature. They just have to do with the human being. It's not a question of ideology, you know, and so it is important that there is this cross-party, non-political alliance that is created to tackle the problem very carefully. As I've said, it is important to look at some phenomena that are emerging with the new technologies, social media, that have come to change the way society interacts with one another. And it's important that this particular phenomena be factored into efforts that are intended to fight sexism in a very effective manner. Of course, cultural norms have to change, and what we call masculine or male toxicity does not have any place in political life. It is something that we need to combat strongly. We should transform our institutions from being male predominant institutions into more egalitarian societies wherein men and women can participate on an equal footing in the management of society. And if, again, we don't pay particular attention to this, and that is my concluding remark, if we don't pay particular attention to efforts to combat sexism, what is going to happen is that the progress that the world has witnessed in women's political representation, in Beijing it was 11%. Today we are talking of close to 1/4 of parliamentary membership around the world being made up of women. If we are not careful, we are going to fall into complacency, and this progress will be unraveled. And we see in some societies today that the progress is unraveling. Countries that were doing very well in terms of political representation of women are now not doing that nearly that well. And so it is our duty, you, the members of parliament, political parties represented here, but also global organizations such as the Interparliamentary Union, to place all hands on deck in order to tackle this problem. Because, as I said, it's a question that has to do with the rights of human beings, and with the rights of human beings, we need to be very intransigent. Thank you very much for your attention. Am I supposed to take a few questions? Yes? Okay.
Hi, hello, Mr. General Secretary. Thank you for your speech. My name is Sunna Ævarsdóttir. I'm a member of the Pirate Party here in Alþingi, and I'm also the chair of the Legal Affairs Committee in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. So we have received your report, and I have also been the instigator of a report that the Council of Europe has pushed forward into the April session that we are having, that regards the response to these very damning results, and the response of the Council of Europe, that is to say also the Parliamentary Assembly, as well as the member states. Now, one of the problems that I faced when it came to getting this report through and getting the response, let's say, a bit quicker than well, the Parliamentary Assembly had not really reacted to the Me Too movement for the 2 years that had passed since it sort of started. And I wonder if this is also an issue that you see in the IPU, that when it comes to debating equality, when it comes to debating women's issues, I think my colleague Rosa Björk Brynjarsdóttir, the chair of the Icelandic delegation, can agree. We've constantly faced the problems with getting it in a prominent place on the agenda of our sessions. So I'm sure that your sessions are similar to ours, just a few sessions a year, and time is limited. And getting a prominent place to discuss these results and the solutions and equality in general can also be a huge issue and a challenge in international parliamentary unions, whichever their nature. So is this something that you experience in the IPU as well, or is it perhaps singly related to the Parliamentary Assembly? Thank you.
Maybe we should have one more question, and then we'll have our time is limited, unfortunately. One more?
Thank you so much, General Secretary, and thank you for coming to Iceland and giving us this report. As I'm a chair of the IPU delegation in Iceland, I have read it and got to discuss it in the IPU session last autumn. But I just wonder, because it's vital to be able to speak about gender equality and sexual harassment in IPU meetings, which we are doing with this report. What do you think, how do you think this can move forward in the discussion of IPU? Because after our last meeting, I was a bit afraid of where IPU is heading, because this is not only human rights, but LGBT plus issues are also human rights. And we were not able to discuss that matter in the last IPU meeting, so I'm a bit afraid that we can really talk about human rights in IPU meetings. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those very interesting questions. I feel comfortable in saying that the gender equality movement in the IPU is much more anchored than it is in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, as you have explained. It is a very strong movement that has been around since the 70s. And so there is strong leadership in the IPU in championing gender equality. It is something that is written into many foundational documents of the IPU, including the declaration on the Universal Declaration on Democracy, where we clearly state that it is important for men and women to work together for democracy to blossom. And so there, I think it's very good. And this has been written into all in the policies, but also in the way the IPU is governed. There is a strong element. You have the Forum of Women Parliamentarians. But there again, it is important not to lock women into a ghetto of preaching among the converted, just for it to be a women's movement. It's not only a women's movement, it is a general movement. So, of course, you have the Women's Forum that articulates issues that are pertinent to gender equality. But this has to be brought into the mainstream of the IPU. And that is where we have strong policies in terms of gender balance delegations coming to the IPU. I know that we have instituted sanctions against parliaments that come to the IPU without women, when there are women in their parliament. This is something that is seen very important if we want to bring women into the mainstream of IPU. So you have those sanctions. And I think I mentioned that resolution there that was adopted as recently as October 2016 on the freedom of women to participate in political processes fully. This is intended to provide a roadmap, provide guidelines for how the IPU should tackle the issue of sexism, sexual misconduct, inappropriate sexual behavior. So it is there. It shows that the entire membership is very aware of this issue and wants to do something about it. But when it comes to the incidents you mentioned happening last time, first of all in St. Petersburg and then in Geneva, where the membership, where some members, I would want to believe, that finally carried the day, refused to debate the issue of LGBTI. I think it was very, very unfortunate. I want to believe that that is not reflective of the general mood of the membership of the IPU. but rather that the IPU membership were hijacked by conservative forces at the time that happened to be in a majority at that particular moment. That the issue of gender equality, the issue of sexual orientation is one that has to be debated. And again, when I talked about the need for parliaments to move into the 21st century, for policies to be fashioned, those policies need to take into account new phenomena, not only the social media, the emergence of this issue of sexual orientation that we have to debate and see how this can be managed without any restrictive policies. So if you ask me, as Secretary General, I don't agree with that decision that was taken by the membership. I think that it is only delaying that debate. Has not put an end to the debate. I think that debate will ultimately take place within the organization, and the organization would be the better for it, I think, in my view. So we should not lose hope. I would definitely support any measures that are intended to have a discussion of this issue. Thank you.